We have so much to cover. Okay, so one of your next lessons is on conflict and theme. I cannot believe they are combining these two things, and I cannot believe that they are doing them in one lesson. I really hope that they come back to these ideas, because this is so central to the concept of reading critically, to understand something really deeply and tease out major themes, especially through conflict. That is just such a big idea to try to cover so quickly. So I really hope they come back around to this. So I'm going to make this lesson a baseline lesson that hopefully, fingers crossed, we can build upon in later quarters and later sessions. Okay. So let's briefly discuss the concepts of conflict and theme. I'm about to have a conflict with this bell right now. Okay, that would be an example of character versus technology. Okay, but let's take a look at conflict versus theme. Okay, one thing to note is that conflict and theme are not inherently combined. Okay, one conflict doesn't necessarily lead into every theme, and there can be more than one conflict. So if somebody says, the conflict in this story is this, that is a conflict within the story. For instance, Harry and Voldemort have a character versus character conflict. However, Ron versus Hermione also has a character versus character conflict. And Harry versus his own fears has a character versus self conflict. So this is conflict in sign language. No, it's not. Just kidding. Don't tell people that. Those are many, many conflicts. Okay, they're basically any character dealing with any problem can be defined as a conflict throughout the story. Now, if you remember our lesson on plot, you'll remember that that line that I used for the plot diagram is a representation of conflict throughout the story. And if you remember, conflict tends to rise over time, because we learn more about the conflicts and we learn more about the characters and we understand why they are fighting each other. Okay. Theme, on the other hand, does not really need to come at any particular moment within the story. Within the first 10 minutes of a story, you can be hit with a theme, but will that theme follow through to the end of the story, or will it change? Okay. An example of this would be like Spider-Man. Spider-Man. His Uncle Ben tells him that with great power comes great responsibility. And that's one of the first ideas within the story that Peter hears and learns. And we, as the viewers, have to decide whether or not we agree with that. Does Peter have responsibility to himself and the city, or can he just do whatever he wants and try to win over cute girls and dance in emo hair? Who knows? Next, let's look at the types of conflicts that there can be. Okay, very generally, every conflict in a story can fit into one of these major categories. Okay, and they are character versus character, character versus self, character versus society. Those are kind of the three big ones that involve people. Then we have character versus nature, character versus technology, and character versus the supernatural or God. Okay. Some of these may be taught to you more heavily than others, especially character versus character and character versus self. Those are pretty broad, and character versus society is also pretty common, especially in something like The Outsiders that you'll be reading. A lot of teenage literature has to do with character versus society. Things like The Hunger Games, Harry Potter, and Divergent could all be described as stories that primarily deal with character versus society. The society has some sort of expectation of them. And you remember our lesson on expectations? That would be an external expectation, right? Somebody's expecting something of somebody else. Okay, so we're going back to that idea. So if somebody has an expectation of somebody else and they are either living up to or not living up to that standard, that is a character versus society conflict. Okay, so let's cover each one of these very quickly. Character versus character is when two people are fighting with each other. That is pretty straightforward. These do not have to be people, however. These can be animals. So like in The Lion King, Scar versus Mufasa, that is character versus character, because it doesn't have to be a man, doesn't have to be a woman, doesn't even have to be a living thing. It can be like a concept, okay? Character versus character are fighting. Character versus society is when a character, like I said, either defies or conforms to the expectations that are put upon them by society and the conflict that arises from that. Character versus self is when the character has internal expectations, and those internal expectations are either met or have some kind of conflict. That is an example of character versus self. So when Harry is like, oh, well, I don't know if I'm going to actually be brave enough to fight this Voldemort guy, that is an example of character versus self. And then we have some of the other sort of not more out there ones, but maybe ones that don't get focused on as much in school. So character versus nature is like survival stories, okay? Like Bear Grylls out in the woods fighting animals, right? Whatever. If the animal is characterized, okay, so if it's like the Jungle Book, so it's like Mowgli versus the Monkey King, okay, that is character versus character, even though the Monkey King is part of nature. Scenes where like Mowgli or Bambi or something is trying to survive in the rain or trying to survive through like a storm, those would be examples of character versus nature. And then you have character versus technology, which is sort of the opposite. Technology is something that we've brought about. That's something that we as a society have developed. So Black Mirror is an example of character versus technology. And then we have character versus the supernatural or God. Personally, this is just me, I split character versus God and character versus the supernatural. Personally, I split those two up. Okay, some people will just combine them in that any supernatural being qualifies, but I don't. I don't think they're the same conflict. Just like how nature and technology have two fundamentally different laws governing them, I think it's the same thing with supernatural and God. With technology, man made the technology, and it's our fault that whatever conflict is happening is happening. Whereas with nature, nature is beyond our control. Nature is something that we cannot influence, and it will do what it does, and we just have to deal with the consequences. Likewise, man versus supernatural, ghost stories about hunting vampires. You can fight a vampire, but you can't fight God. Whether it's the Judeo-Christian God or Allah or Mazda from Zoroastrianism, I don't care what God it is, you're not beating it. That's the point, is that the God has a set of rules, and if you don't follow those rules, your immortal soul is in peril. Whereas with the supernatural, Van Helsing does not care what Dracula thinks of him when he stabs him in the heart. He's not concerned that he will lose immortality as a result of this conflict. So, from my opinion, God and supernatural are two very different conflicts governed by very different rules and completely different power levels in which mankind has to struggle. And if the character of God can be killed or fought in any way, then it's not actually a God compared to the character. So stories like Hercules. Hercules can beat up Hades. That doesn't mean that it's character versus supernatural, because Hercules is supernatural. It's Hercules versus another character who is equally as powerful. So it's character versus character that they're struggling against. Okay, that's just my hot take, but do with it what you will. Some teachers will say that supernatural and God are the same thing. I'm going to say that they're very separate things because of how those rules change in those conflicts. Okay, that was 10 minutes worth of talking about conflict. And this is why I was really worried about this being shoved into one big category.
Reminding you to take the following steps to help mothers when you feel sick. Coronavirus stop with me.
Okay, so how are these conflicts interacting in a story? I think one of the perfect examples of this would be Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, because in A Christmas Carol, the character Scrooge actually faces many forms of conflict throughout the story, and all of them serve a pretty obvious theme. Okay, so I'm going to use this as an example for the duration of this video and the next video, which is on theme. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in the next video. So please tune into that one. All right.